The Budget Committee will now come to order. Today we're going to have a hearing on the amendments for the California Forward budget proposal. We've had multiple hearings on this proposal and have been going through it exhaustively. We're not going to take it to a vote today. We're going to just go through the author's amendments so that we're all very clear on what is and isn't in the final version of the bill. As I said, I've been saying all along, we're talking about a package here that's been put together by California Forward. It's not something that that anybody loves the entirety of it, but the concept is to try to get a package that everybody can live with and that moves us forward. So with that, I'd like to call on Mr. Fuhr to walk us through his proposed author's amendments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I do want to underscore that I am prepared to accept the amendments that are noted in the committee analysis as author's amendments today. This set of amendments really emerges from California Forward's assessment of the comments, critiques, questions that have been raised by the committee thus far. And I will delineate them briefly, and were there to be questions, either I or Mr. Silver or others can respond to those questions. One of the proposed amendments conforms the initiative language on the PAYGO provisions to the legislative language. In the original set of proposals, recall the PAYGO provision stated that if the legislature has in mind a new program that would expand the cost of services or would seek a tax reduction of $25 million or more, the legislature has to identify the funding source. But the initiative provision was not parallel to that. And this amendment says that $25 million threshold pertains to legislation, and it also pertains to initiatives. Another amendment exempts from the PAYGO provisions bills that respond to emergencies that have been declared by the governor for conditions of disaster or extreme peril. Another provision takes out of the Constitution and moves to statute some of the time frames for the discussion of what our revenue projections look like. Another provision deletes a number of specific dates from the Constitution and moves them to statute, similarly. Another provision deletes the local government finance provisions from the bill and the constitutional provisions and moves them to another constitutional measure. That, by the way, is not something that emerges from California Forward, but from me. So the budget measures are clearly before us at this point, with the local government measures to be taken up at a later time. Another provision clarifies that the 2/3 requirement regarding fees and taxes applies to a fee that replaces a specific tax. The word specific had been omitted inadvertently from the language of the original proposals. If it replaces a specific tax that was repealed or reduced in the current or the immediately preceding fiscal year. There are a couple other technical changes, one regarding trailer bills and another, actually both regarding trailer bills that we can talk about if you wish, but they're really rather minor in nature. So these are the provisions that are before us today. There was some question before we convened about whether we'd be voting or not, and the chair, of course, has indicated today as a hearing on these amendments. The reason for that is this. When we grapple with major issues, it's really appropriate that there be a full opportunity for members of this committee and the full body to be completely aware of the elements that we're voting on. And this is a great example of making sure that we had an opportunity to vet such ideas. So with that, I'm done, Mr. Chair. If there are questions, either Mr. Silver or I will be happy to take them, and then we'll proceed at a later date to actually vote on the package as amended.
And just to clarify, the amendments that you're putting on, the California Forward is taking these on as its full, is perfectly fine with these and considers this the California Forward package. So with this entire provision, that's something California Forward is embracing.
Mr. Silva?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Fred Silva with California Forward. I think that these provisions are all stated in a way that respond to many of the observations that you all made here, some of them technical, some of them policy, and so we've accepted those and are proposing those for you today.
I think that's an important point of clarification if it wasn't clear already. That
Yes, very well. Yeah, if I was unclear about that, Mr. Chair, I think we are very clear. These emerge from California Forward. The exception is the severing of the local government finance piece from the balance. We can take these things sequentially.
Great. Are there any questions from members on the committee? Mr. Swanson and Mr. Buchanan. Ms. Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On your Amendment 4, the language net decrease in state revenues, which net increase or net decrease exceeds $25 million annually as adjusted for inflation pursuant to the California Consumer Price Index. So the purpose of the $25 million target is to try to control spending. Is that a fair description of the purpose? Why it's $25 million?
Well, actually, what I'm going to do at this point is defer to Mr. Silva because that number originates from the California Forward bipartisan set of proposals.
Yeah, I think our effort here, if we're talking about the way in which major tax reductions or major programs are funded, that rather than simply having that as a requirement, that anything that you did to create a new program or anything you did to reduce a tax would be subject to it, we needed a threshold. And our kind of general analysis was what ought that threshold to be? Is it 2 million? Is it 25 million? Is it 100 million? And I think what we look back over time, looked at small things that you do that don't make a big difference, that don't grow a lot, and other larger things that you do, and found that the 25 million was probably a reasonable threshold. That there isn't a natural law here about what the threshold ought to be, but we felt that the $25 million threshold would give you the ability to look at a program and say that's enough that it needs to be financed.
And so the 25...
Might just to elaborate for 1 second. To be clear, this pertains to legislative proposals and, as amended, to initiatives. The budget is a different matter. If the budget seeks to, because there's with revenues and expenditures to match, if the budget seeks to expand or a program or reduce a tax, the budget is exempt from the pay-go provisions. This is just if an independent piece of legislation proposes a new program or a reduction, or a citizens' initiative proposes a similar change. Those two are covered by this provision. The budget is not.
And so this would be put on the ballot, and and can be approved by a simple majority. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
And so, if you can put the spending limit, this definition, but it will still take a 2/3 majority to raise the revenue to increase revenue to cover such expenses.
Well,
raise taxes.
But two things are true. First, nothing about this set of proposals changes the threshold necessary to raise revenue. But the answer to your question is it depends. So, for example, were there to be in the next fiscal year an extra $26 million that weren't available this year, and it was decided by the legislature and the governor to attribute all $26 million to a new program, and that were in the budget. The budget itself has to pass by 2/3. That idea in particular doesn't independently require 2/3. By contrast, if under the same scenario, next year I were to propose a measure a separate legislative measure to increase preschool education by $26 million, I either have to identify a reduction in spending equal to that, or there has to be some revenue from some source, either majority vote or a tax change, that would enable that $26 million to be counterbalanced.
And the tax change would require 2/3.
If it were to be independent from the budget and a tax change, that would require 2/3.
So, but if this is, for the most part, this proposal will propose a formula that will require a majority vote within the guidelines that are presented here in response to this $25 million threshold, but you still leave in place the 2/3 requirement to approve additional revenue or taxes.
Well, again, my answer stands. The 2/3 requirement remains. There are multiple ways to achieve the funding necessary that don't implicate that, but it is possible that one would have to find it. One possible way to deal with it would require 2/3. Others would not.
So then how do you counter the argument that that this proposal then is akin to a spending cap? Or do you embrace that notion?
Well, actually, let me say first, this is not a spending cap. I think some would like to see a PAYGO provision that were. This is not. As I said, were revenues to increase 1 year to another by an increment of $26 million or $226 million or some other number, this measure would not affect the ability of the legislature and the governor to change programming in the budget accordingly and just spend more money if we want to. If it's there, if it's not, it's not. This measure pertains exclusively to a legislator's individual bill in a given year and how we fund that. And in that respect, it requires that legislator to figure out how this measure, independent of the budget, would be paid for. That it does.
So then why wouldn't we, if we're putting this matter before the voters, why wouldn't we give them the whole choice of being able to also make it for something, a simple majority to approve taxes or revenue?
Well, that, again, I will say the California Forward folks decided against doing that. Do you want to elaborate, Mr. Silva?
Yeah, as we've mentioned before, but part of our objective here is to put some discipline, if you will, into how you all finance major new obligations. We did not want to come to you and say you ought to have a spending limit on the budget itself. The budgets have to be balanced, and to the extent that there's sufficient revenue to meet those priorities, then you use that revenue to do so. So our view has been all about budget making. And the question of tax policy and whether or not you want to change the vote requirement on taxes was not a subject that we're addressing. We're simply addressing the way in which budgets are made. I understand the concern about making tax policy, because obviously there's a higher vote threshold for taxes than there is for spending. But we're suggesting with two matters of fiscal discipline, one of them that new programs need to find a way to finance those obligations, and the other is to set aside one-time revenue that's sufficient in order to warrant a majority vote for budget making.
So if we wanted to make education a priority, then we can, it takes 2/3 for us to figure out how to raise additional revenue for that, but it's a simple majority necessary to cut.
Well, for education, it's always been a majority vote. It's never been a 2/3 vote for appropriations to support the school.
I'm just talking about bringing additional revenue into the state. I'm just what I'm making reference to here. It just seems like that this cake is sort of half baked. I mean, I understand the budgeting systems. I understand the accountability for increases, but you have not provided for any improved system for us to be able to identify revenues if we decide that education needs to be a priority and we need to fund it with more money.
But before you answer, and before Mr. Jeffries leaves, we do a quick quorum call. I know you had to run to the door. So.
Blumenfield,
Present.
Nielsen, Adams, Arambula, Bell, Berryhill, Brownlee, Buchanan, Caballero, Carter, Chesbro, Cook, De La Torre, Emerson, Evans, Fuhr,
Here.
Bertani, Fuller, Gilmore, Harkey, Huffman, Jeffries, Jones, Nastandi, Ruskin, Silva, Swanson.
Mr. President, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I
Please
just
go
want
ahead and
to say
respond.
this. One could argue, and I think it'd be accurate to say, that this provision, not the amendment, because the amendment pertains to initiatives, but the existing provision forces this legislature to consider major new policy objectives in the context of the budget, because it doesn't change the rules regarding the budget in this way, one way or the other. Rather than having major new policy decisions with major new money attached to it dealt with outside the budget. Because once it's in the budget, same rules as currently apply, and PAYGO doesn't pertain. It's only when we consider it in isolation from the budget that PAYGO is taken into account. So it has the effect of requiring all of us to consider the trade-offs in the whole budget when we think about major new initiatives.
Well, and I would conclude with this. It's my opinion that if this legislature had a simple majority to approve the budget and a simple majority to approve revenue or tax increases, California would not be in crisis. We would figure out how to do that, and from testimony from the public, we'd figure out what our priorities are, and we'd spend it accordingly to those priorities. And I don't. So this is fine, but I just don't think it goes far enough to be able to make the system balanced, so we can, in fact, fund the priorities that are important to the state.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. Ms. Buchanan, followed by Mr. Berryhill.
I have a more technical question. We spent some time, I think it was at the last meeting, talking about the dates by which budgets had to be submitted and approved, and I still have some concerns. I didn't notice any changes in the amendments because when you read the bill, it says on or before May 1st of each year, after the appropriate committees of each house of the legislature have considered the budget bill and bills implementing the budget, each house shall refer the budget bill and bills implementing the budget to the joint committee of the legislature. So we don't get the May revise until May 15th. And it seems to me to ask us to complete our work before that date is problematic. Because that's not allowing each committee then to make final adjustments or whatever. And then it says no later than June 25th of each year, we still have that date, that we not only will pass the budget bill, but we'll have the bills implementing the budget, the trailer bills. And I think passing a budget and passing I would like you to consider anyway that if we pass a budget, whether we pass it early June 15th or on June 25th, you then give the legislature like 10 working days to complete the trailer bills. I think there needs to be something that's, a little bit more of a reasonable deadline. So I'd just like you to respond to that.
Mr. Silva?
Yeah, thank you for the point. And we continue to work with the staffs about how to set up a schedule. One approach that we've talked about and probably need to talk some more about is whether or not by joint rule you could set up a schedule, because one year is going to be different than another. This year obviously is very difficult, and you want to rely on the May revision for the House versions. Part of the issue here is that the houses don't speak anymore. You take your subcommittee reports and send them directly to conference. And so the idea is to try to get the houses to come up with views about what the joint committee ought to be doing. And so we want to work some more on that. We're not through with that provision. It's just that we weren't able to settle it at this time.
It just seems to me if we are to do our jobs, we have to be allowed to see what the May revised numbers are. And again, my own suggestion would be that the trailer bills have to be completed within 10 working days of when the budget is approved. So you give the legislature some ability to deal with all of that in an orderly manner, because if not, if you're trying to rush and get everything through by June 25th, it seems to me that and your budget's not approved till then, that just kind of increases the probability that you're going to have even more cleanup legislation later on.
Right, and I will say the amendments before us today do move these dates from Constitution to statute, which has the advantage of creating flexibility around that will enable us to grapple with your concern.
Well, if wouldn't that give us less flexibility?
It removes the dates from the constitutional language and puts them into statute.
Okay.
Statute we can change as need be. So
right, but it just seems to me if we're going to go to the voters and ask them to approve this, there ought to be sort of a reasonable, realistic time frame in there.
Mr. Silva, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, there are two sets of dates here. One of the sets are the fiscal updates that the governor is supposed to do, which we have taken out of the Constitution, put in statute. The question that you're raising is, what do you do about the timing issues for the houses finishing their work? And we're going to work some more on that.
Okay, Mr. Berryhill, followed by Ms. Harkey.
Yeah, looking at the analysis, it appears that the measure excludes the budget bill from statutes that may be referended. And is there a different procedure for the trailer bills? And please explain the process a little further and why you chose to include this provision.
Sure. The issue is this. Currently, the budget bill, because it has an urgency clause in it, is not subject to referendum. So because this is the budget bill will be adopted by a majority vote, it won't have an urgency clause in it. And so the view was to continue the tradition of not having the budget bill subject to referendum. Now, the budget implementation bills, because they take effect immediately and do not have urgency clauses, they are subject to referendum. What was missing was a procedure for the referendum. Because currently, a bill that does not have an urgency clause is subject to referendum, and if a group wants to referend it, they file a petition with the Attorney General, and they've got 90 days in which to get it to the ballot. And so what we needed to do was to put a parallel system so that a budget implementation bill that does not have an urgency clause, which is subject to referendum, now has a procedure that parallels regular statutes. So yes, we make budget implementation bills subject to referendum, and they have the same procedure that a regular bill would have.
Okay. PAYGO. One question I have on PAYGO is when would the baseline be created, and would that be from the date of passage of the measure?
No, there's actually, Mr. Silva, you should correct me if I misstate this, but the PAYGO provision circumvents the necessity to set a baseline.
Okay.
Because what it does is it pertains exclusively to new programs or tax reductions proposed in a piece of legislation in a given year. So the bottom line is, if it's new or expanded, it is reflected in a given year, a legislator proposes a $30 million increase in after-school programs.
Okay.
As a piece of legislation, right then, you got to find $30 million from a source to counterbalance that. You would propose a $30 million tax decrease in that year. Same thing is true. But the PAYGO provisions are exclusively focused on a new program or a new tax expenditure and don't relate to, for example, restoring previous cuts.
Okay. One other concern I have about this provision is that it limits a net decrease in revenue without a corresponding cut to the programs. My concern is that it may limit our ability to provide targeted tax credits and incentives that may ultimately actually produce more revenues. And so we've just handcuffed our ability to say, we want to give manufacturers a tax cut and try to bring manufacturing back or help sustain it. I'm concerned about that handcuffing of our...
I understand the concern, and my answer would be similar to the response I gave to Mr. Swanson, and that is it doesn't have any implications one way or the other if one pushes that decision to have a new tax expenditure, an increased one, into the budget process, because the budget is exempt from the PAYGO provisions. It's only if there's a new Berryhill bill, independent of the budget, that proposes a new tax expenditure that has seized $25 million in isolation from the budget, in which case then one does have to find corresponding revenue. But as part of the budget process, which is where you want the big decisions to be made, if it's in the budget process, you are not handicapped in any way.
So let me just make sure I'm hearing this right. So I run a bill that does a targeted tax credit to the widget manufacturers of California, 50 million. I've got to then find 50 million somewhere else. How does that work?
There's a piece of this that sometimes we don't focus on, and that is the legislative analyst is going to look at this and come up with an assessment of whether or not there's a net decrease in revenue. And let's assume under your example that the legislative analyst comes back and says, actually, there won't be a net decrease in revenue. And so the obligations that you have under PAYGO to find a revenue source to counterbalance it wouldn't exist because they came to the conclusion, as you did, that there is no net decrease in revenue.
Yeah, that's a fair point, actually. And it pertains not only to reductions, but also to increases in spending associated with programs, which may, in fact, have corresponding cost savings that the legislative analyst by these provisions is directed to consider.
So I've got to convince the LAO that this is going to bring in more tax revenues than it's going to actually cost.
Or propose it in the budget process itself.
At least there's some analysis that needs to be done on it, which is part of our point.
Yep.
Which is interesting. I think the issue you're raising is a little bit of a preview to some of the things we're going to be talking about tomorrow vis-a-vis tax cuts and tax deductions and program cuts and how they really, at the same time, they both can raise revenues or both can decrease revenues, but they are, in essence, both spending of the state. So I appreciate you pointing that out and want to point it out as a plug for tomorrow's hearing as one of the issues that's going to come up. Next is Ms. Harkey, followed by Mr. Arambula.
Well, I first want to precede my comment about the comment that was made about being maybe not a tax, what do we call them? We call them a tax expense, being somehow revenue neutral or actually increasing revenues would only be possible if that's the way we were scoring. But we don't score those things in a dynamic fashion. They're pretty level. So I don't see that really is a response to the question. We don't get a dynamic scoring of potential revenues.
Well, I'm one of those that argues that that these tax measures should not always be looked at in a static sense, but rather what they'll do to the economy. And part of my answer to Mr. Berryhill was that you'd expect the legislative analyst to do that. And if you want to do a dynamic modeling system, the Department of Finance has one, and maybe it's time to get it updated and use it. And I know that Peter disagrees that the analyst doesn't do that, but you all ought to chat with the analyst about the way in which they analyze these measures.
So it's worthy of a discussion, which brings me to one of the points that I found very, very troubling of the whole discussion that we have is that somehow the only way to raise revenues in this state is through taxation. And we know that's not true because we're seeing our unemployment go so sky high. So I would like there to be another avenue, which brings us to the dynamic modeling, that if we didn't have 40%, 25%, 30%, and overall 13% unemployment in this state, we probably would be generating a lot more revenue to fund the school programs and fund the other things that we all want. And so I would hope that maybe with these discussions we could get into a real dynamic modeling of what tax policy does to either encourage investment in our state, which encourages job creation, which then creates revenues, rather than just trying to look for who's left, what bones are left to pick. And I say this with all due respect, but we're in a real tailspin here, and we have to get people back to work. And that is the surest way to put revenues back in the coffer. Our expenses have, from 1998 to 2008, we have doubled expenses in the general fund, from 57, I think, to 103, and then we drop back. So we continually spend, but I don't think I like some of these things of having a limitation of PAYGO on the bill. And you answered that for me. It was not a budget PAYGO.
Ms. Harkey, also, if I might, in response to what you just said, though, I do want to point out that in the statute, 2591, there is a provision that says, regarding the PAYGO, for purposes of the section, the determination by the legislative analyst as to whether a bill or measure would result in a net increase in qualified state costs or a net decrease in state revenue may include consideration of the impact of program changes attributable to cost savings or changes in revenue of other state or local programs that are reasonably expected to occur as a result of implementation of the bill or the measure. And then it says the legislative analyst is to determine the time frame for that analysis. That's actually in the legislation before us now.
Well, thank you. If we could get that kind of analysis that actually was encouraged, I think we'd have a lot less dispute on the floor on many issues. I am very concerned that the trailer budget bills could, in fact, become the de facto budget, because those trailer bills often change a lot, and we could be submitting a budget that's out of balance based on the trailer bills. I've raised that concern.
Yeah, I think it's a good concern, and we spent some time in an effort to narrow what constitutes what we call budget implementation bills. And what we'd like to do is to dismiss the term budget trailer bills from the discussion and rather focus on those bills that are required in order to validate an appropriation. And so we're trying something new here that says the only time that you have a qualified budget implementation bill is when it actually changes a statute that would otherwise be required to implement an appropriation, an appropriation. So what you shouldn't see is you shouldn't see budget implementation bills that do something that isn't otherwise required in the Budget Act. And furthermore, we're suggesting that there be a legislative council key to what constitutes a budget implementation bill. So our effort here is to try to narrow the scope of what constitutes these bills that you have that you call trailer bills that are supposed to implement the budget when in fact many of them simply don't.
And is there a budgeting provision? I mean, could they get skewed such that you no longer have a balanced budget with the trailer bills, as we've kind of seen?
No. I don't think so.
Yeah, certainly systems can get gamed, and I'm not suggesting that they can't. But we tried two levels of protection. One of them is the budget itself has to identify the need for the statute. So let's take an appropriation for a given department, and that department has responsibility for an entitlement, and there isn't sufficient money in the budget to fund the entitlement, so that a statute needs to pass in order to change the entitlement. All right? So you see that in the Budget Act because the Budget Act says so, and you see that in the Budget Implementation Bill because it's keyed and it refers back to the item in the budget bill. So hopefully we've created this box that's tight enough that we've narrowed the definition of what constitutes a budget implementation bill.
Thank you.
And so things like open primaries and CEQA exemptions and other nasty things that are thrown onto the budget would no longer be part of it.
Very good, because they wouldn't be tied to an appropriation. Exactly.
Amen. Mr. Rambula, followed by Mr. Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fear, two questions, if I may. The first one's really more of a clarification. You know, we've had some discussion about what limits this may place on the legislature, but I'd like to refer to citizen initiatives, if I may. Some years ago, prior to our governor declaring his candidacy, he was involved with a citizen initiative to create an after-school program, which I'm sure is a worthwhile effort, as are many other worthwhile ideas that get placed on the ballot through the referendum process. But that particular initiative has cost the state, or has infringed on the state's budget, to the tune of about $500 million a year. Your package of proposals would require that initiatives of that sort have a way to fund them going forward. Am I correct?
Correct.
And secondly, would you give us your justification or your rationale for accepting the entirety of the California Forward reform package? Because I suspect all of us could find something in there that we don't like, but on balance, it seems to be a good step forward. And so I would ask if you would express your views on why this package as a whole needs to move forward in its entirety.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Rambla. I think there are 2 points. The first one is we are in a status quo that, especially on the budget, that is completely unacceptable. We have to change from where we are. Doing so requires compromise, because otherwise you can't get a measure before voters to change the threshold for the budget vote, for example. We need compromise. That doesn't mean you compromise your values. You fight for your values. But it does mean you compromise your interests to try to find common ground. And so for me, this package contains a series of measures that find common ground, that retain sufficient flexibility but do constrain the legislature in important ways in the future to try to preempt problems that we've been living through from recurring in the future. The other aspect of this package that's important is that the pieces do substantively interlock. In previous hearings, we've discussed the interplay among various provisions here, which if taken in isolation would have some power, but together have much more. So for both those reasons, and I suppose underlying all of it is, California Forward has had presenters here reflecting ideology that's really across the board. You've had extremely progressive people here advocating for this package. You've had people who are extremely conservative advocating for this package. They have found a way to find that bipartisan common ground. I urge that this body does the same.
Any additional comments from members? Is there any comments from the public? Either for or against these amendments? Mr. Berryhill has an additional comment. We'll go ahead before the public comment.
One area, the county-wide strategic action plan. This bill lays out a process for local agencies to develop a fiscal plan. In counties where a plan is approved, it would allow local government to pass a 1-cent sales tax and use tax by a majority vote. Why is this in the bill? Are we not meddling in local government? And I thought that this was more about state government. And so I get concerned when we start to meddle into local governments.
Well, in fact, Mr. Berryhill, the amendments before us today sever the local government provisions from the balance. And for the purpose of this committee, we are considering exclusively the budget-related proposals.
Okay.
But thank you for your question.
Okay, any additional members' questions? Otherwise, ask members of the public. Mr. Hanson, would you please identify yourself?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. Jay Hanson with the California State Building Trades Council. We are here in support of this measure. Additionally, I have authority to speak on behalf of the Laborers Union in support, Operating Engineers Union in support, Electricians, Sheet Metal, and Plumbers Union in support. We're working with a large coalition of labor, and we're working with our sisters and brothers at the California Labor Federation to try to also bring them on board with what we think is a very fair package. I know that many difficult cuts have been made to the budget over the last several years, and a lot of those programs, if not most of those programs, should be restored to the place where they've been before. And this package, should it pass, should not be used as a vehicle to prohibit the legislature from making the cuts and restoring those cuts to the programs that deserve and need to be moved forward. That being said, there have been a lot of difficulties in moving reform forward in this legislature, and regretfully I've talked to some people that would be very happy just to see the whole system crash, to show just how dysfunctional California government is, and somehow believe that they're going to get a leg up on moving programs here, and I think that's on both sides of the aisle. This is a reasonable package of measures. The public is looking for reform to happen from the legislature. If it doesn't come from the legislature, it'll come from third-party interest groups, and I don't think that serves anybody well. That's not the way that the government should work. It should be done by the capable legislators that we have here today. I think there's some really great measures that are part of this package. As Mr. Fear mentioned, you can always find something that someone's not going to like, or I think as Mr. Rambo, something to like or not to like. But I think there's a good reason to support this package and to move forward, and I hope that in a bipartisan fashion people can come together and see that there are some measures here to move forward. A pay-as-you-go measure makes a lot of sense. I spent 8 years working in the legislature as a staff, and I was there during the boom years in 2000. We had a huge surplus of money, and we spent that on a lot of ongoing programs. That was a mistake, and I think it was recognized, and you just can't run effectively when you're making those kind of decisions. And I think one-time increases should be spent on one-time programs, and that's just one of the many parts of this reform that we support, and I hope that the legislature will be able to find a place to move forward with these reform proposals and support the California Forward Initiative.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Sarah Flocks from the California Labor Federation. And we very much appreciate the amendments that were put forward today. We think it's a good start. And we do think there are some really good aspects of this package, especially the majority vote budget and having initiatives have the pay-go requirement so that they go through a process where voters have to approve the funding and there's no more unfunded mandates. But we do still oppose this package. We have some serious concerns about the language for the fees. We know that there was an amendment to the fee language, but one of the things that was kept in is that a program service activity that was previously funded by a specific tax, which was the amendment, but which was repealed or reduced. And we have concern about that language because we think that it would mean that any program, any activity which almost all receive some sort of funding from a tax. If that is reduced, if there's a cut in the previous year, then it would take a 2/3 vote instead of a majority to have a fee to replace that funding. And we're concerned that that is going to basically take away the majority fee and require the 2/3 vote now. And so that language, the amendments have not kind of corrected that language in our view. And we still have concerns about the pay-go requirements. We feel that taking bills and giving them over to the Legislative Analyst's Office, one, that probably doesn't have the staffing at this point to be able to handle the volume of bills going over to be assessed is one concern. And then also the concern that without having a majority vote on revenues, this is going to take majority bills. If we have a bill around the enforcement of paid sick days, for example, the LAO finds that's going to cost over $25 million. That's a majority vote that is now going to be a 2/3 vote. Or, as the language is now, it would have to contain provisions. And that language we are concerned about. Assemblymember, you had said that the bill author would have to identify the revenue or the program that would have to be cut, which was in the original California Forward language. And we're concerned that the contained provisions language that is currently in the bill is much more strict and would require a 2/3 vote. And I appreciate the explanation about the budget trailer bills being exempt from pay-go. That was a concern, that this would then take a process around policy and push it into the budget process without the hearings and without the public input that it has now. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Mr. Fuhr, would you like to make some closing comments or respond?
Oh, just very, very briefly. I think that in the next hearing we'll have a chance to thoroughly go through any critiques of the proposal and address them where they can be addressed. The important issue for today is we've now had 4 hearings that in a very transparent way display what this set of proposals is. And I think it's extremely important that all members feel accurately that the proposals have been fully vetted. Very soon it'll be time to actually vote on these measures. And I just want to say as a predicate to that later meeting that all our constituents are eager to see us display the leadership necessary to change the dysfunction in the state so we can move the ball forward. No one says that any package of proposals is going to address every single problem, nor is this or any proposal going to suddenly find $20 billion for this year's budget. But proposals included in this package will make it far more likely that in the future we can avoid some of the struggles we've been grappling with by creating systems that are designed to succeed, as opposed to the current conditions that frequently set us up to fail. That's what's on the line. And I will urge in a subsequent meeting that we come together in a bipartisan way and enable the voters of our state to decide for themselves if this is a direction that truly advances the goals of the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So without objection, the proposed amendments are accepted as the author's amendments are accepted into his bill. And next we will try to meet on the 24th approximately, but if we can schedule it, we'll be in the middle of May Revise, and we will work to find an appropriate time to have that meeting. Again, Mr. Ruskin points out there is a meeting tomorrow, not on the California Forward. There is a full committee budget hearing. What time? 10 a.m. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.